The Gospel of Thomas is perhaps the most famous non-canonical gospel that everyone seems to know a bit about. People often ask questions like, why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in the New Testament? Or, did you know it might be an independent source for the sayings of Jesus? But what does it actually say, and why isn't it included in the Bible? This gospel is preserved in a single Coptic manuscript from the Nag Hammadi library, a cache of early Christian texts discovered in the mid-20th century. Although we have a few fragments in Greek, the complete Coptic text dates to the 4th century CE and likely copies an older Greek version from the 2nd century. Some scholars even suggest a late 1st century date. Dating the Gospel of Thomas is challenging because, unlike the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's a sayings gospel made up of 114 short sayings attributed to Jesus without narrative or sermons. This format means editors could have added to it over time. Scholar April DeConnick argues that Thomas underwent several stages of composition, beginning as a kernel of Aramaic sayings from the mid-1st century and developing through the 2nd century. To keep it simple, though, we can say it was probably composed in Greek between 135 and 200 CE, with some sayings possibly tracing back to the historical Jesus and originating in Aramaic. Many consider the Gospel of Thomas a Gnostic text, though this is more complex than it may seem. Unlike classic Gnostic writings, it doesn't mention an evil demiurge or figures like eons or archons, which are present in texts like the Gospel of Judas. Thomas mainly includes sayings, some of which have an esoteric tone, and it was found alongside other Gnostic texts, such as the Apocryphon of John. Interestingly, a large portion of Thomas resembles the New Testament Gospels, but with slight differences, leading some scholars to believe it's an independent source for Jesus' sayings. For instance, in Thomas 96, a saying closely parallels Matthew 13:33, but with subtle differences, suggesting these texts could be independent accounts. Some scholars believe Thomas may preserve older versions of Jesus' sayings, as they often appear simpler than the more elaborate parables in the canonical Gospels. However, Simon Gathercole, in his extensive commentary, argues that the Gospel of Thomas is not independent of the canonical Gospels, proposing instead that the compiler was aware of the synoptic Gospels. Gathercole points to passages in Thomas that seem influenced by Matthew and Luke. He also notes that since Thomas dates to the 2nd century and lacks specifics about 1st century Palestine, it doesn't offer much about the historical Jesus. Given current scholarship and available sources, Thomas contributes little to reconstructing a historical view of Jesus. Some sayings may be ancient, perhaps reaching back to Jesus. But the evidence is inconclusive, with strong arguments on both sides. Why then is the Gospel of Thomas not in the New Testament? Given its overlap with the Synoptic Gospels, one might expect it to be included. However, several factors help explain its exclusion. First, early Christian communities showed resistance to including more than 4 Gospels. Evidence shows that the 4 canonical Gospels circulated together early on, before the broader canon took shape. For instance, Papyrus 45 of the Chester Beatty collection contains the 4 Gospels and Acts, dating to around the 3rd century CE. By then, Thomas was already circulating, but the 4 Gospel tradition was solidifying. Moreover, early church leaders, including Hippolytus, Origen, Eusebius, Cyril, Didymus the Blind, Jerome, and Ambrose, were critical of any Gospel of Thomas. They saw it as heretical. Origen's statement is striking. Also in circulation is the Gospel according to Thomas. These come from those who set their hands to it, but the Church of God approves 4 alone. We can't be certain they were referring to the Gospel of Thomas we know today, as there were other works by that name, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Still, this opposition indicates significant resistance to accepting any gospel attributed to Thomas. Additionally, canonization wasn't just about formal decisions by church authorities. It was a more organic process, with certain texts gaining popularity and circulating widely. For example, Matthew and John were highly popular in early Christianity. We have about a dozen manuscripts of Matthew from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, but only one complete Thomas manuscript from the 4th century. Thomas simply wasn't as widely embraced or copied as the canonical Gospels. In sum, the Gospel of Thomas is a monumental find from the 20th century that has deepened our understanding of early Christian texts and traditions. However, it remains outside the canon, partly due to early opposition and its limited popularity. It's well worth reading to gain insight into early Christian thought, and it's brief enough to explore on your own. The Gospel of Thomas is indeed one of the most fascinating discoveries in early Christian studies. Unearthed in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, this ancient text is composed of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which are quite different from those found in the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This document provides a rare glimpse into early Christian diversity, as it reflects a style of teaching focused on wisdom and spiritual insight rather than the narrative style typical of the New Testament. Here's a bit more on why the Gospel of Thomas remains outside the canon and why it's valuable for study. Number 1. Historical background and non-canonical status. The Gospel of Thomas didn't make it into the canonical New Testament, largely due to the influence of early church leaders who were concerned with defining Orthodox Christian doctrine. Canonization was a process that included texts that aligned with what early Christians viewed as essential beliefs in the teachings of the apostles. The Gospel of Thomas contains ideas that some leaders considered unorthodox, such as an emphasis on direct, personal enlightenment over communal worship or sacraments. In some ways, it reflects Gnostic influences, which were generally shunned by early church authorities. Number 2. Distinctive sayings of Jesus. Unlike the canonical Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings rather than a cohesive narrative of Jesus of Lord, his life, death, and resurrection. Some sayings in Thomas mirror those in the New Testament, but others are more cryptic and focus on the idea of gnosis, knowledge or insight, encouraging believers to seek divine truth within themselves. This approach to spirituality differed from the communal, outward-focused practices emphasized in the canonical texts. For example, saying 3 of the Gospel of Thomas reads, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you." Here, Jesus speaks of the kingdom as something internal rather than a literal place, aligning with Gnostic themes of inner enlightenment. This contrasts with the New Testament's more external or communal focus on the kingdom of God. Number 3. Value for understanding early Christianity. Despite not being canonical, the Gospel of Thomas offers valuable insight into early Christian thought and diversity. It reveals that there wasn't a single, unified belief system in the early Christian world, but rather a rich tapestry of interpretations. By studying this gospel, readers can gain a broader perspective on how different groups understood Jesus' teachings and the nature of divine truth. Number 4. Example of how it differs from canonical teachings. In saying 113, Jesus reportedly says, his disciples said to him, "When will the kingdom come?" Jesus said, "It will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it." This notion is unique because it implies that the kingdom is already present on earth, but people are unaware of it due to their lack of insight. In contrast, the canonical Gospels often speak of the kingdom as a future event or a transformative spiritual reality brought about through Jesus' life and mission. The Gospel of Thomas remains an important text for anyone interested in exploring the diverse ideas that shaped early Christianity. While it's not part of the Bible, reading it can deepen one's understanding of how early Christians interpreted and experienced Jesus' teachings.